people are shuffling in here. Uh, Note this will be recorded, and so if you're viewing this on recording, welcome as well. And if you found this useful or like to pass it along, please do. It'll be up on our YouTube page before long. I feel obliged to say like and follow and point at something, right? That's what you do on YouTube, right? Welcome. My name's Kyle Mox. I'm Associate Dean for National Scholarships at Arizona State today. And joining me today are Shay. Shay, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I am Shay Masterson. I am one of the advisors in the Office of National Scholarships Advisement. Specifically, I'm the program manager of outreach and inclusion, and it's great to see you all today.
Dr. Bhattacharya.
Hi, I'm Neelanjan Bhattacharya. I'm a faculty member at Barrett, but I'm also the faculty mentor, and I work this year with the CLS students and Boren applicants. I will be mostly in the background today, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Yeah, so today we're actually going to be talking about organization and editing with AI, and particularly in the fellowships context. But what we've found is, as we've been discussing ethical and effective use of AI in the fellowships context, we realize it's very translatable, right? You can apply these principles in your academic work and professional work. And there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding AI, and a lot of fear, and a lot of misuse. And so our hope is that with this series this fall that we clear up some of these things. So if you didn't catch our other sessions, they are on our YouTube page as well. We began with just a general introduction to integrity and how to ethically use chat generative AI within the fellowships context. In our last session, we talked about brainstorming, how to use generative AI to decode applications and look at criteria and help generating ideas to get you going. And so today we're going to be talking about the next stage in the writing process is organizing and editing your work. And then next week we'll conclude on Halloween with how to use generative AI to help you prepare for interviews, which if everything goes well, maybe you'll get an interview for one of these fellowships. So in the chat, if possible, I wonder if we could grade this one. If you went to any of our earlier sessions, we know we've been using sort of a traffic light metaphor of green, yellow, red to grade prompts we're using with AI in terms of their level of appropriateness. So if we were to ask generative AI like ChatGPT to edit my personal statement to make it sound more authentic and reflective. So if we were to use that prompt, would we think that's a green level prompt, a yellow level prompt, or red, meaning appropriate, not entirely sure, or no, that's definitely unethical? Any thoughts? Is that a green, yellow, or red? Maybe a yellow. Sandeep says red. Shay, you said yellow with a question mark. What's your thinking there?
I think that the idea that it could be more authentic, if you're asking something that it's not you, so how can it be more authentic to you? But then the word reflective, I thought could be useful. So just kind of looking at between those two words specifically, that's where I was seeing there could be some use out of looking for
Yeah.
more reflection.
Yeah, and we look at the verb that we're using with the prompts, and I think that's always a good way to judge, so we say edit, we're asking the AI in this case to change what we've written. So we could tinker with that to make this more of a greenish yellow. It's definitely a reddish yellow, if not a red, because we're asking it to do some work for it. And yeah, I agree. It's ironic to ask the generative AI to make it more authentic. It's like asking the teacher to say, well, how would you like me to be more creative? We could ask for suggestions perhaps, or ask it, what are some ideas or ways I could do that? But, yeah, I think this is definitely a dark yellow, probably a red, because it's asking it to do too much work. So today we are going to, again, continue to learn how to use AI ethically to organize and clarify our ideas, really thinking about green zone prompting and thinking a lot about alignment in terms of how we organize what we've written and thinking about transitions between ideas, which is one of the things AI is very good at, and then really thinking about how to maintain our voice while reaping the benefits of what generative AI can do with our writing. So the way that I try to think about it is that the generative AI is a knowledgeable friend, right? We often go to our friends. We've all got the one friend who's a great writer, and we ask, "Oh, what do you think? What would you do with this? Does this flow?" And so we think about it as working alongside of us, not working for us, not operating as a ghostwriter. And so if we're offloading our work like that, then it's going to be vacant of any voice and clarity and specificity and authenticity. And so we want to retain our authorship, make sure we're very transparent in the use here, and making sure that what we're producing has integrity. Um, and just keeping in mind, and we were actually just talking about this before we logged on, um, we can spot the AI composed essays quite easily, or at least the ones that sound like it. In either case, you don't want to sound like it, right? It doesn't matter if you had Gen AI do it. If you sound like you did, then it's probably going to be vacant of any concrete detail. It's going to be vacant of any sort of authentic sounding voice, sort of variations in tone and style that are natural to humans. And it's just going to lack the sort of soul that is quite apparent when somebody's writing about something they're excited about or is important to them. It'll be done perfectly. It'll be well organized, but ultimately it'll be mechanical. And that's not really going to get you what you want when you're applying for fellowship. So the other issue here is, the act of writing is an act of thinking. We often don't even know what it is we know about something or think about something or feel about something until we try to write about it. And so Joe Didion's quote, I write entirely to find out what I'm thinking. If we turn the task over to generative AI, we're shorting ourselves that opportunity to figure out something, right?
I was actually thinking about this the other day, and once upon a time, I used to be able to um, memorize people's phone numbers. I
Mhm.
used to be able to do quick math calculations in my head. Um, and with the advent of cell phones, my ability to do both of those things has been severely hindered.
Yeah,
Um, and doing calculations and memorizing things is critical for our brain health, especially the older we get. And so I was starting to think about like generative AI in a similar way. If we start relying on it too much to do some of that thinking for us, even if it's as simple as like writing an email, not something maybe as high stakes as writing a fellowships essay, but even just writing email, it's taking away our ability to think about those simple everyday things. And what does that mean for us long term as individuals and as society? So it's useful, but yeah.
right. Yeah, absolutely. I can still remember my parents' phone number, of course, that I grew up with, and they haven't had a landline in 25 years. And I can remember my best friend's phone number from fifth grade, right? And it's interesting. And I can actually remember poems that I was forced to memorize as an English major, right? And I can still recite those 30 years later. They're in the hard drive, so to speak, right? So as we get into our discussion, we're using this spectrum really. There's not really you notice it's not really a hard dividing line all the time between what's all good and what's not great, right? But really we're thinking, a green prompt would be one that is diagnosing or identifying or just pointing things out for us. Again, like a knowledgeable friend, a great collaborator. Whereas ones that are asking it to produce things for us, depending on our intent, depending on what we do with the product, are going to be in that yellow zone, and ones where we're just straight up offloading our work. Um, you know, Maybe out of curiosity you want to see what it would do, but if, the temptation is very strong to simply accept out of hand. So yeah, we're gonna talk about organization first, and I couldn't resist using this. I don't know if anyone's a Taxi Driver fan, but this is an inside joke from the movie Taxi Driver. Google it if you haven't heard of it, but new Martin Scorsese documentary out there. Check it out. So why does organization matter? Writing is externalized thinking. It's a way of making our thoughts remain static in a place where we can share them with another person. It's a technology. It's relatively new to the human experience, right? And so if our writing isn't well organized, then our thoughts are not well organized, right? We don't have a great understanding of how the different things we're talking about interrelate. And if you understand how they interrelate, then you do truly understand them. AI can be useful for mirroring back your logic, right? And showing you where the gaps are. So maybe you're not apparent clear on them because you're standing too close to it. And again, that's why we love peer review. So AI can function very well in that capacity. So we think about green zone prompts, anything that would help clarify thinking, reveal structures, strengthen coherence, that's going to show you where these things are lapsing. You can take things that you're brainstorming and ask it to help identify some themes there. Like maybe you're looking at this big pile of free writing that you did, and you're like, I'm not sure I see the through line here, and you're curious where they might be. And you may or may not agree with what the AI produces, right? But at least it's a helpful attempt to sort things. Um, yeah, too often, I think one of those useful things that I do in peer review is ask my collaborator, what do you think the main point is here? Or this is what I was trying to say. Is that clear? I think it's better if you give it to them and say, well, what do you think the point is? The nice thing with the AI is that it can go through that pretty quickly and say, this is your main point. And if what it produces isn't what you're trying to say, then you've got a clarity problem, right? Looking at topic sentences, looking at transitions, sort of the more mechanical, functional parts of how we organize our thoughts, and pointing that out for us, right? Yellow stuff, where we get away from reflection and more into guided decision making. And again, it's who's making the choices here. So we could ask it to suggest a couple of ideas, right? What are some ways to organize this essay? It could come up with great ideas. But you have to be careful because if it's taking away your decision making or you're giving yourself into it, identify sections that might be out of order and explain why. If you're treating this as a conversation, as a dialogue, that could be a useful exercise, right? You're more curious as to why it's giving you the advice that it is. And you might say to yourself, I'd never thought of that. Or you might say, well, that's actually pretty superficial advice. I'm not sure I agree, right? Where might I need clearer transitions? It's giving the agency to the bot. Could I strengthen alignment between my thesis and these paragraphs, right? Again, it's probably going to be really vigorous in giving you um, text that you could use, right? It tries to be as super helpful as possible. And it's going to be very confident in what it gives you, right? And so it's going to be very attractive to want to use it because, if anything, the AI is always very confident. Definitely red if we are delegating any kind of thinking, structural choices, our voice to the model. We ask it to write anything, reorganize, write, edit, giving it your task, right? And to some degree, that's what technology is for, right? To take over our more mundane tasks. Well, this is not mundane stuff, right? This is you deciding how you're expressing your thoughts, and it doesn't know what you're thinking, and it actually doesn't understand really what you're saying. It just understands how the code of the language you're using works, because it's using trillions and trillions of megabytes of language model to emulate that, right? So again, thinking about who's in control, who's making decisions. So let's look at some use case examples. So from mess to map. So you could take your brainstorming ideas and maybe your bullet points that you're working with in the early stages and say, well, what are some linkages here? That could work well because it's going to surface hidden connections that maybe you hadn't thought about, right? Maybe these connections are out there and have been written about in a way that you hadn't been exposed to yet. It's a way to build meta awareness of your own thinking, right? To say, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. That's actually correct, right? It shows possible connections, but you got to decide if that makes sense or not. So in our example student here, this is somebody who wants to work in museum studies. They've had some experience working in local libraries. So they're just kind of jotting out things for their personal statement about why they do what they want to do, things that they're thinking about, just loose ideas, right? And this could, doesn't seem like a whole lot. It could be kind of a challenge to figure out how to sort this out. Shay, how often, do we work with candidates where this is when they say, I have a draft to review, right? And this is what they bring us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually encourage it depending on the timing to the deadline and where we're at with that first draft. that our office is saying, it's okay if what you share with us is messy. It's okay if it's really brainstorming, and then we can have a dialogue and we can collaborate, as Dr. Monks has said,
Yeah.
on where those through lines might be, what might make the most sense for the particular thing that you're writing for. And I think one of the biggest mistakes I see is not starting with brainstorming in our writing process.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to generate a lot of potential content, just all of our thinking about it, because we try to nail the final product on the first try. Like there's a lot of stuff that maybe got left out that would have been really useful. So, so if we use that original prompt, hey, can we group this or cluster this in 3 or 4 different categories? The AI would suggest, hey, maybe there's a theme around accessibility and representation. That was one of the things you were talking about. Here are 3 things that you were saying on that theme. Another potential theme, collaboration and community engagement. Like that could be something you'd like to approach in this essay. Or you're also saying some things about purpose and identity. We can connect the dots between those 3 things, right? And you may or may not agree, because maybe what you were thinking and what you wrote on your bullet list, that's not that representative, but at least it can get you thinking. In my own use, I have found quite often that I do not agree with what the AI is suggesting to me or is pointing out in my own writing, but it's generating my thinking about it. And when I'm trying to decide why that's not right, I actually come to a better understanding of what it is I'm trying to do. Outlining with agency. So let's assume then that we've decided on some of this content that um, we'd like to try to wrangle into a structure, and we're trying to figure out what's the order. So we've written a messy first draft, and we could give that text to our friend and ask, what are 2 or 3 ways that we could organize this? There are different organizational strategies, and I think a lot of beginning writers have one mode, right? They have the chronological mode. I'm going to start at the beginning, at the earliest thing, and I'm going to write through till the most recent thing. And there are a lot of different options. I like to use prompts that are explanatory to say, well, what are the pros and cons of each approach? If it understands who my audience is and what my purpose is, what's the strategy behind each of these choices, right? And it is strategic thinking. There are many different approaches you could take. It keeps you in the driver's seat, and what we want is deliberate choices, not, oh, I guess that first one might work, but understand why you've made this choice. So if we think about those themes, we could think about how we can cluster those in different ways. So we could try it thematically, right? So if we did a thematic approach, we could start by talking about our ideas about accessibility and representation. Then we can move on to our ideas about collaboration, engagement, and purpose and identity, right? We just kind of move between those 3 clusters. Another strategy would move chronologically. We could be more of a personal narrative where we talk about how did we first get interested in working in archives, then how did that lead to our undergraduate projects that we did, and then how did we get to our current questions about access and identity. Same content, just organized in a more linear fashion. Or another compelling way to approach it is cause and effect. So maybe start by writing about your thoughts about the problems of representation. When did you first notice these things? And then what are some reactions to that? Community collaboration as a response, and then resulting in impact on identity and belonging, right? And so it could be another structure that's maybe not chronological, but is causally related in a different way.
When we are choosing the chronological option, early interest for these kinds of applications is very rarely going to be from your childhood, even depending on where you're at in life and academics, also probably not teenagehood. Even if you genuinely have wanted to be an archivist ever since you were 5 years old, probably not true. But even if it is, early usually for these applications would be, if you're a junior or senior when you began college. If you're a grad student, it would maybe be between undergrad and graduate school, something like that. So just throwing that out there.
Yeah. Yes, we've read the "I'm a Curious Child" narrative way too many times, right? So once we've gotten things organized a bit more, we've decided, okay, here's my strategy, right? I think I'm going to go with this more thematic strategy. And what I have found in the more competitive, very what I call high altitude, like postgraduate fellowships, where they're really concerned with what's the impact you can make on society. I've actually found the thematic approach tends to work pretty well because you're putting your ideas and your value proposition first, meaning what is the work that you represent, as opposed to here's the personal narrative of how I got interested in. And in many cases, they might not care, right? Maybe it's useful for you, but again, you'll weigh that out. Considering the audience, considering the fellowship, what's the best strategic choice in this case. So once we've started assembling, we've taken our strategic approach. One of the things we want to be sure is that we're aligning each of our segments, sections, or paragraphs in a way. So we've written a cohesive draft. It's a useful exercise to ask the AI, what's my main argument here? What do you think the thesis of this is? And if you're not in agreement with what comes back or it goes off in a different direction, you know that you've got some work to do, right? So it gets back to your logic, expose areas where it drifts, and really thinking about your purpose, making sure you're staying on task. So the example that we're using here, same student, right? In my undergraduate research, I explored different kinds of community archives, and I was interested in how they work with local organizations and schools and how they documented underrepresented groups because I've always been interested in history and identity and how museums preserve that. I tried to understand what makes some archives feel more accessible than others, especially for people who don't usually see themselves represented in institutional collections, right? Early draft, obviously it's got some work to do, that's fine. If we ask the AI, what's the main idea here, and it come back with a very short and more concise summary of it that says, well, your central idea is about how community archives empower underrepresented groups by collaborating with local institutions, right? I thought, oh, okay, yeah, actually that's what I was trying to get at. Or no, not exactly, right? Um, so we can take that one step further to say, here's what I'm trying to argue. I'm pretty clear on that now. Does this paragraph clearly align with that thesis? Explain how or why not, right? And again, I think that explanatory aspect of things is important because that allows you to make choices. So you're testing, right? This is almost like you're testing code that you're writing for a computer program. Again, looking at drift, repetition, and maybe it encourages you to think more consciously about how you're linking the different subordinate clauses to the larger argument, right? Um, I think a lot, and most writing instructors think a lot about the evidence that you're providing to support your main claim. So it diagnoses, but you make the decision, ultimately, is what we're getting at there. So we continue that example. They've got a more refined point. Community archives strengthen public memory by empowering underrepresented groups to preserve their own stories, right? That's a nice thesis statement. And so we have an example paragraph and ask, here's my thesis. Am I aligned with that? Again, this is a very brief version of what a paragraph might be. This paragraph connects to the thesis by showing active participation in preserving stories, but the link to empowerment could be made stronger. The focus here is more on process than impact. You're like, oh, yeah, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to focus on empowerment. And now you need to go back and revisit and reconsider that, right? So points to areas. Another area I found AI very useful is focusing on transitions. And we're kind of working through the writing process here. So once we've determined that, okay, my paragraphs, they're individual units of thought that are aligned well with my overall point, but now am I ushering the reader through point A to point B to point C as smoothly as I could? So we can ask it, is there a logical flow between paragraphs? And I don't know about you, Shay, but I think the most common question I get when I'm working with students, because I usually begin by asking, great, well, what's your main concern with this draft? And most of the time, particularly in the late stages, I just want to know if it's flowing. I'm never quite sure what people mean by that when they say that, right? How do you respond to that request usually?
Well, I also receive that very often. And so I'll kind of try to break it down. Like, is there a particular section that you're struggling with, whether that be introduction, body, conclusion? Is there particular paragraphs where you're not sure how they align back to each other or connect back to each other? Those kinds of follow-up questions to the
Mhm.
how is it flowing?
Yeah. And what Shay's describing there is exactly the same process if we're working with generative AI, because if you come to one of us with very broad, overarching questions, um, you're going to get very broad, overarching feedback, right? And the more specific and focused your questions, the higher quality of feedback that you'll get. We, being sentient beings, are more likely to ask you follow-up questions to direct the conversation, whereas the AI is just going to make a go of it, right? Um, and so that's, to me, that's one of the major shortcomings is it doesn't have that agency to ask you questions to get you to ask better questions of it, right? So if we're specific in our questioning to say, I'm really looking at the transitions between these three paragraphs. And so we have paragraph A that's talking about community archives, and paragraph B that's talking about digital tools. AI suggests, hey, that shift from community trust to digital access feels a little abrupt. Consider a bridge sentence that links technology to its role in sustaining those community relationships. So that's almost a writing prompt for you then to say, oh, okay, I think I can do that. Let me try that. So, the thing to remember, and we think about these as ethical guardrails, right? And so use it to reveal patterns. It's very good at pattern recognition. That's essentially what it's doing. It's finding patterns in language. That's how it's predictive, right? Gaps in your ideas, things that are expected to be there that aren't, really thinking about the cognitive relationship between the different sections of what you've written, and thinking about alignment. And, it brings to the surface options that you have for structure. But where we don't want to be using it is making decisions about your argument, about the order in which you're putting them, writing anything for you, reorganizing anything for you, and allowing it to have judgment because it doesn't reason, right? It's not making judgments. It's making guesses based on large amounts of data and hopefully getting good feedback from you, right? It's very, very eager dog. It really wants you to be happy. Um, but ultimately, you have to make the choices.
Also, to connecting that with some points you've made earlier, when we see something that has seems to have been in the yellow or red zone use of AI, there are some things that there's some specific words, ways to phrase things. Also, Dr. Mox mentioned earlier with one of the examples, like this is a very short example, just or shorter than what a paragraph would typically be, but we're using it for a real life example that we can get through quickly here, right? AI actually tends to have more shorter paragraphs. You can kind of see even visually if you look at an AI generated essay that the length of the paragraphs tend to be short and similar to one another and those kinds of things. So those when you put the generation, the writing, the revising into the hands of generative AI, those those patterns will be revealed to your reader, whether it's your professor, a selection panel for a fellowship, an employer for an internship, whatever the case may be.
Yeah. Yeah, and we are starting to get reports back from the workforce in terms of employers discovering pretty quickly which employees have over relied on AI in their education and which are over relying on the jobs. And so it's going to be in the workplace. We have to learn how to use it. But again, what our hope is there is that we grow and use it as a collaborator and really figure out, how can I use this to empower me as opposed to taking away my agency. So editing is another great task, right? And I know probably, and honestly, AI has been in this space for years. Autocorrect in Microsoft Word is AI. Grammarly is AI. Um, you know, Language is code, right? It's a signifier of an idea, and it has rules and it has protocols. So this is the sort of thing that an automated system can recognize when you're breaking syntax or grammar. sometimes we break the rules on purpose, right? Sometimes we do that for effect. And so humans are unpredictable and AIs are not. So the central question you have to ask here is once your ideas are clear, you've got them arranged pretty much in the way that you want them, how can you refine them now without getting into what Shay was talking about in terms of that very mechanical, polished, shiny, standardized prose that we can spot a mile away, right? That we know doesn't sound like an undergraduate student. Revision is about reseeing, right? And so we're just not fixing things. We're not just trying to make it flow. As we're working through, we're actually reconsidering the relationship between what we've said and what we are thinking, right? And so we're looking at this with fresh eyes. Clarity is important, but not clarity to the point of losing that particular vibe of humanity, right? It should not be making rhetorical or stylistic choices for you. Those particular choices, the words that you use, the words you have in your vocabulary that you're comfortable with, the length of your sentences, the patterns of your speech, these are a fingerprint, right? There actually are programs out there that can identify your written fingerprint. This is how they caught the Unabomber, right? There have been uses of that same technology to spot when people have allowed too much help, right? Either from a human being or from an AI. So, embrace that fingerprint if it's been working for you, right? We want to illuminate opportunities, not imitate human language. And so, thinking back to our green zone, anything that would help you see your writing more clearly. So, identify, highlight, point out, right? Asking as a friend to collaborate. Are there any sentences that are long, unclear, or repetitive? And I think it's important because, again, the AI is really eager to help. Um, I always add in, please don't rewrite, right? Just point it out. And that way you can make a choice. Otherwise, it's going to suggest revisions and you might just want to take it. Anywhere where my tone or style shifts, can you point out any areas where I'm being redundant? I found that quite useful myself because as we're editing and moving things around, maybe we didn't notice that we copied and pasted and left it an idea up here and it's also down here, or we've just said the same word 6 times. I see that quite often, right? It's like, did you know that you used the word committee 8 times in this paragraph? And your eyes might not catch it, but this is a really good thing for the AI to catch as well. As we're thinking about yellow zone stuff, any kind of prompt that asks for feedback on substance or structure that's going to have you make a decision about what to do with that, right? Suggest ways to improve the flow of the section. Again, I think that's too broad of a question anyway, but you're asking for suggestions from the AI as a point, as opposed to just mirroring back what you've already done. Point out areas that could be more concise or engaging. I think concise, but how does a computer program know what humans find engaging, right? And it's going to make a guess. Explain how I could make this argument more persuasive. That's a tough one. Shay, what do you think the yellow or the caution with that one could be? Because it seems pretty productive, right?
So again, I think it goes to the persuasive and the more, right?
Okay.
So it's not a human. It doesn't know what is going to persuade or persuade to what? What are you trying to persuade the reader to? In the fellowships application, maybe to select you as the winner, but it's
Yeah.
probably a bit deeper than that we want to look for in terms of your persuasive arguments. I want to go back to point 2 for a second, though, too, because if you are asking it to be more concise for you, AI does err on the side of big generalizations. So sometimes what it can suggest to you is removing the more concrete examples that you've shared from your experiences, some of that tone and voice that is more specific to you as an individual. So that's, another way where it can be, instead of maybe pointing out things that are repetitive or words that maybe are unnecessary, the more concise you might get, it removes you
Yeah.
from the statement.
Yes, and I've experimented with it quite a bit. because particularly in fellowships writing, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, that has word limits, right? And so there's been many times, and my chat GPT's name is Steve, short for Stephen Dedalux, right? If you're a James Joyce fan, but we've gone through some examples, and I noticed that there was an example or an image missing that I really liked, and like what was the first draft of that. Like, hey Steve, what happened to that anecdote about the kitten in the rain? And oh yeah, well, we just had to cut that to make it more concise, right? And there's no judgment there. It's just grabbing things and throwing them out the window when in reality, like for you, that was actually a pretty crucial part. You're just looking for ways to trim words, and it's just throwing out whole sentences, right? So again, you have to be making the judgments here. And red zone, anything it's doing for you. Rewrite this paragraph to sound more professional, right? Polish my essay for clarity and flow. And I worry that so many student writers are probably using some kind of prompt like that, which is why so much of student writing ends up sounding exactly the same, which is not what we want. Edit this draft to make it sound more authentic and reflective. That's where we started today's conversation, right? And the idea of asking a computer program to make you sound authentic, yeah, I don't even have a comment on that, right? Or cut 100 words from this essay. That's a really tempting shortcut, right? Because it's 11:59 p.m. You need to get this in soon. You can't get it to fit the text box. And so what we found is like making sure we've got enough writing time to be more reflective, right? So yeah, let's
So,
look at some use case
sorry,
examples. So go ahead, Shin.
something that we've talked about in session 1 and session 2 is maybe spend some time using some things that you've already written and are kind of done with, right? Like an assignment you've already submitted, a personal statement that's already come and gone, and use that with practice with your generative AI to try to spot those kinds of things that it's doing and see the patterns that might become apparent through generative AI, when you're not on a time crunch, right?
Yep.
So these examples can become more apparent to you, and you can see firsthand how it does and does not work well for your purposes when you're not trying to get something done by a deadline that is at midnight and it's 11:59.
Yeah. Yeah, I think desperation leads us to many less than good choices, right? So diagnostic editing, and I think that's a good phrase to keep in mind. Like we're using this as a diagnostic tool. So identify sentences that are long, unclear, or repetitive, but don't rewrite them. So it can spot patterns that the average reader would think of as awkward or wordy, but it's keeping that choice in your hands because it's just pointing out where those are. So I do think it's important to include that don't rewrite them part of the instruction. And it's an opportunity to learn, right? In all honesty, I think back to how I learned to write the way that I did, and it came a lot from my teachers simply correcting my writing to show more efficient ways to do it, more stylistic ways to do it. And over time, I learned to really appreciate that because I trusted their judgment. And then I could see, oh, I see what they've done there. That's a really interesting way to do that. Or I hadn't thought about it that way. Like, oh, you know what? I keep using that same construction. They keep pointing it out. So I actually think you can use the sort of diagnostic editing as a way of learning how to improve your own writing and editing. So if we look at an example. When I first began working in environmental policy, I didn't realize how much local politics and community organizing would shape our initiatives. It was difficult to coordinate between multiple agencies and community leaders, but I learned how to navigate those relationships effectively. And, the AI points out these sentences are clear, but the second could be tightened. The phrase difficult to coordinate is vague, and I would agree, considering specifying what made coordination challenge. Right. There's an opportunity for an example, an illustrative example. And you cannot ask the AI to generate an illustrative example because it wasn't there. It doesn't know what happened in your life, right? Editing for vigor. Again, if you ask the right questions, you'll get much better responses. And so we have many style guides that we use, and we distribute them in our canvases. We give them to students. There are some really easy tricks. they're not even tricks, it's just good practice and how to make our writing more vigorous, more effective, more concise. So one of the things I tell people a lot is like, let's ditch the weak verbs, like avoid to be as much as possible. Let's use more active verbs whenever we can. Let's get rid of nominalizations where we are taking a verb and making it a noun, right? So it can identify where you're being too abstract, where you're being too static. And we point out like, oh, wow, look, I didn't even notice because it's your own voice, right? So we're learning to have intentional control over our syntax and rhythm. And that's really the difference between a beginning writer or a student writer and somebody who's a competent writer is you have ultimate control over what you're doing with that written word. So I was responsible for the coordination of outreach events that were focused on increasing community engagement. We've probably read this sort of bullet line from a resume hundreds and hundreds of times, right? But as our friend points out here, it relies on weak verbs. Was, were, I was responsible, that were, right? So these are to be constructions. They're pretty weak verbs. We could be far more active. And then nominalizations, coordination of outreach events. Coordinate is a verb, but we've nominalized it and turned it into a noun, which means that we've sucked some action out of it. Consider activating the verbs and clarifying agency. So an edited version, if you took that advice, I coordinated outreach events that increase community engagement. Not only have we saved a lot of words, what else has happened to that sentence?
We've become the actor in the sentence, um, not so passive, not putting some of the ownership on other things.
Yeah. Yeah. I was responsible for the coordination versus I coordinated, right? It's much more active, it's much more attractive, and it makes you seem like more of a leader, right? Just by that simple change. Like we can emphasize our leadership and agency just by our syntax, right? So this is probably one of the most common things we do. It's something that AI would be very good at spotting out for you, right? Concision, right? As we were talking about, like, okay, this doesn't fit the box. Character count on Google Docs got me again. Can you suggest what could be cut or condensed? Please do not rewrite anything and preserve my tone and meaning. Again, that extra layer of prompting, I think, is essential to keeping you in the green zone because it's like, very eager to please you. It'll say here, and it'll keep mine always keeps asking me, would you like me to do this next? Would you like me to do that next? Trying to predict what I want next. But keep it in the diagnostic, right? I want it to spot some redundancy and verbosity. Um, thinking about where have I repeated or been redundant? Where am I using too many words? Helps you see where you're over explaining or overwriting, avoids, ethical pitfalls in that way. So if we look at the example, I see the comment in the chat. We'll take a look at it in a moment here. We have a pretty long paragraph here, right? My commitment to public service began during my sophomore year when I volunteered with a local literacy initiative. The experience made me aware of. I'm skimming this and I'm like, I don't feel like finishing this paragraph, honestly. So we know that this is wordy because we've repeated access to education, community-based programs, consider condensing or combining, right? So it's not doing it for you, but it's giving you a suggestion for how you might do it. So we could do that with an edited version. My commitment to public service began when I volunteered with a local literacy initiative, where I saw how education transforms lives. Since then, I focused on supporting community-based programs that promote equitable learning opportunities. So there's no repetition there. That would be good advice to follow. So, question in the chat. I'm confused about the framing of this conversation because isn't using AI at all pretty unethical when you consider the environmental impact? Yeah, that's a decision you have to make, right? And that's separate from what we're talking about, to be quite honest. It's not something that we control. And if that's something that's a priority for you, then I would suggest you not use it. The way that folks in the AI sphere I've been talking to is that we're picking teams at this point, right? And if you feel that that's a disincentive for using it, that's a disincentive for using it. So in terms of ethics, in terms of the guardrails with editing and revision, Use AI to diagnose clarity and flow, identify stylistic patterns, check for consistency of style and tone, spot redundancy and wordiness, right? Those are really good things to use it for, but not to rewrite, paraphrase your text, generate polished or final versions. And quite honestly, I've grown tired of reading very polished writing at this point. Everything I read seems to be ultimately polished. And anytime you're losing your voice or tone, masking your authorship or intent. Um, and before we move on, while we're talking about ethics, to add another point, I don't mean to diminish Kelly's question at all, but it is, separate from the ethics in terms of how to use it. Um, One of the things I'm learning too is using ASU's AI Builder, for instance. It gives you options in terms of environmental impact. There are some AI platforms that use far more power, far more water than others. And a lot of times it's choosing the right tool for the job. So even when designing our own internal AIs, you can choose ones that are more environmentally friendly. The last one I was using even had a token system that was showing you exactly how much power you were using, right? Um, and the advice that we get and give is like, well, you don't have to use this for everything, right? But the other thing that I guess I've seen in conversation is it's creeping into all aspects of life, right? Unless you willingly turn it off from your Google, it's going to default to AI. It's built into our phones. It's built into our Microsoft products, right? So it is a question, right? When and where do we use this technology, right? But again, the environmental impact kind of separate from our conversation at this point. And I don't mean to diminish it, but it's just you have to choose. And I think that's a nice segue to say, how can I know what I think until I see what I say? Um, we often have difficulty defending our ideas or thinking through things if we haven't set them down in an order, right? Um, so we've thought throughout, the first three parts here, how to generate ideas, how to think about audiences, and how to think about how to communicate what we already know, right, in a meaningful way. But yeah. Other concluding thoughts, Shay?
I think just a little bit more on the idea of the ethics of using it at all. I think another thing to keep in mind, and it's been said a couple times, is whether you use it or not
Mm-hmm.
is up to you. It is here, and people and students and applicants are using it, not necessarily all of them.
Right.
And so just reiterating, this is coming from a way of how can we use it in a way that we're still being the owner of our work. We're still engaging in that writing process and that thinking process in a critical way. So just kind of reiterating, that's how we came to this series, and that is our focus today. Yes, there's other conversations around AI and the ethics of it, but we're just zeroing in on this part of it.
Yeah, I mean, in simplest terms, the most ethical use of AI is not, right? It sidesteps all of those problems to sit down and do all of your work at once. Um, we don't necessarily endorse the use of AI. I'll say that. I think there is great potential there if people are willing to use it for educational purposes and instructive and diagnostic purposes. Um, but again, my encounter with a lot of students is many of them don't want to, in the fellowships realm, use it because quite they're quite aware of the authenticity required to write an effective application. But I've been on some review panels this past year, and I can tell you there are a lot of people using it. And in fact, one of the foundations that we work with did away with one of its required essays because its reviewers were tired of reading the same essay over and over, and so they just, rather than fight it, they just got rid of the essay prompt entirely. So our hope is if you do choose to use it, that you're using it more effectively to accomplish your task and to be a companion in your writing, not as a way to get it done faster, right? So as final thought, as we take away, if the writing helps you discover what you think, what does the ethical use of AI help you discover? Because we've agreed, I hope, that if we want to stay in the green zone, we're not using it to help us think, we're using it to do something else. Let that question marinate for a second, but any thoughts on that?
So definitely helping us identify our own patterns in our voice and our tone and our writing, common structures that we fall back on, words that we are eminent in our own writing, can also be a thought partner in helping us see some of those through lines in the things that we're saying, the things that we've done, the points that we're trying to get across.
Yeah, and as somebody who, my academic background is in English and literature and writing studies, I think a lot about the function of language and its relationship with our own thought as we read and our own thoughts as we write. So I've been really interested in watching the development of this over time and really thinking about the technological function of language, and how easy it is to allow our thinking to get so squishy that we can be persuaded by ideas generated by machines. And I'm fairly concerned about that as well. So I do hope as we're using it, it's helping make, if you choose to use it, it's making your thinking more vigorous. It's making your writing better representative of what you're thinking. And it's allowing you to be better at identifying misaligned thoughts, misleading thoughts, or thoughts that are just simply not well supported by evidence, right? That's my hope anyway. So um, as we're looking at the last remaining schedule, we've got one more session on how to use AI to help prep for interviews. There are a lot of really interesting applications of it for simulating conversations between people. And I've experimented with a couple of them. They're quite interesting. But any other thoughts, questions from our guests here today? Anything else you'd like to know or add or say? Great. Well, wonderful. Again, if you're interested in any of our other programming, you can check out our events page on the website. We've got always more workshops coming up. But yeah, wondering if there are any national, international scholarships for international students I got to start working on now. Yeah, absolutely. Check out our scholarship database, right? We have a database right on our website, and that's one of the things you can narrow down searches for in terms of eligibility. And so there's 100 or so programs there that we can search. Absolutely. And any questions, of course, can go right to our email, onsa@asu.edu, and we can make sure that it gets answered. Great. Well, Shane, thank you. Dr. Bhattacharya, thank you. And again, this will be available for review on our YouTube channel if you're interested in that. And hopefully, if you found this useful, we'll see you next week for our final session.